Please join with me in prayer. May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me. And may these words that you hear be captured by your soul and enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. One of the commentaries I read on this morning's scripture passage from Acts calls this story a foundational myth for Christian believers who are not Jews. It's foundational because of the gospel's offer of inclusion. It tells a story of one who is not included in the Hebrew tradition, religious tradition, but who is brought into the new Christian faith. It's a powerful story. It speaks to us all, whether it's a myth or whether it's a recording of actual historical happening. I prefer to think of it as a historical account because I think it makes a much better story, and I like good stories. Philip, the follower of the way in this story, as Gary was just mentioning, was one of 7 Greek-speaking Jews appointed to a new ministry earlier in the book of Acts. As was said in the introduction, the Greek-speaking Jews, the Hellenistic Jews, were complaining that their widows were not being treated fairly in the daily distribution of food. The disciples countered that they just had too much to do. They were too busy to give their time to waiting on tables. And so the community picked Philip and 6 other men, Hellenistic or Greek-speaking followers, including Stephen, and they were given the job of overseeing the daily distribution of food in the community. And, of course, as he said, in the United Church language, they would have been called diaconal ministers. And that ministry continues to exist in our church. So as the story unfolds, Philip finds himself on the road to Gaza, the desert road, and he comes upon a chariot. I think the chariot isn't one of those war chariots that we see in the pictures of chariots. It's more like just a light carriage, would have a single horse and a driver and the occupant in the back. When Philip sees the chariot, he feels compelled to head towards it. The passage says that it was the Spirit that compelled Philip to go. And I think we may use different language, but I think all of us have had that kind of experience before, of feeling compelled to do something. Where does that come from? I can relate to being compelled to that inner voice that Philip was somehow hearing. I'm sure you can relate to it too. I can even remember arguing with that inner voice once upon a time. I was working on a sermon, and it wasn't going where I wanted it to go. And I wasn't sure where it wanted to go, and I was fussing about this sermon. And I suddenly heard this voice say to me, "Go back and read a sermon that you preached a couple of 3 weeks ago." And I remembered the sermon it said. And I said, in my inner voice, "No, I'm not going to go back there. It has nothing to do with what I'm speaking about now. I'm not going to waste my time." But then I found myself wasting my time because I couldn't figure out where to go with the sermon, and that voice kept on saying, "Go back and read that sermon." So finally I got up, went over to the filing cabinet, hauled out the sermon, read it, and threw it down on the desk and said to myself, "There, I read it, and it's just as I thought. It has nothing to do with what I'm working on." I turned back to my sermon, and the way forward was there in front of me, and the road ahead was open to me. So sometimes we dig our heels in, but still, if we listen to that voice, it takes us to places that we aren't sure we're ready to go to. Well, it's a good thing that Philip didn't ignore or argue with the Spirit, because as he drew near, he heard the person in the chariot reading from the book of Isaiah. Philip asked him if he understood what he was reading, and he replied that he didn't understand because there wasn't anyone there who could explain it to him. He invited Philip into the chariot to talk about Isaiah's prophecies. And perhaps it's when he got into the chariot and turned to look at the man that he was talking to, that he suddenly realized who this person was, who he was talking to. In Egypt and in Ethiopia, young boys of promise were often castrated in order to prepare them for the kind of role that this Ethiopian eunuch was fulfilling. He was in charge of the entire treasury of the Queen of Ethiopia. He was a person with great wealth and power in that country. Castration prepared him to fulfill that role because that would mean that he had no progeny. Therefore, he had no personal axe to grind. He was no threat to the leaders because he couldn't rise to a level of leadership. He was only a civil servant, and he couldn't provide a challenge to the leadership of the people he was serving. That's why he was castrated and had that kind of life. It was a good life for him, but one that was limited by virtue of his condition. It was a very limited kind of prospect that he had. The text also implies that he was a God-fearer. God-fearers were a large group of people in the Roman world who were drawn to Judaism because of its teaching and because of its ethics. A large group of people who were drawn to the faith, but who never became Jews, were not circumcised, because if you were circumcised and became a Jew, then you were bound by the Jewish law, and you had to keep the law. But God-fearers could take what they wanted of the Jewish faith and its teachings and everything and live by it, but they weren't bound by it. So these God-fearers were a large group of people. We find them, a lot about them, when Paul does his journeys, his mission journeys through Asia Minor. He often goes to the place where the God-fearers gathered for worship instead of going to the synagogue on the Sabbath. So the eunuch was a God-fearer. We know that he was a God-fearer because he went to Jerusalem to worship, but he couldn't worship like a Jew. He couldn't go into the inner sanctums of the temple where Jewish men were allowed to go, because he wasn't a whole man. And in order to be able to enter the temple as a Jewish man, you had to be a whole man. So because of his condition, the Ethiopian eunuch was excluded from much of life, and especially from his Jewish faith. So despite his wealthy position, he remained marginalized by the society. But he was a sincere, enthusiastic learner. And one can imagine Philip getting quite animated and excited as he explained how the prophecies of Isaiah had been fulfilled by Jesus, and how the community was growing as a result of all of these people who were flocking to follow Jesus. And one can imagine that as the man responded positively, that he would have been very animated and excited by what he was doing. And I can also imagine Philip recoiling suddenly when the eunuch saw a pool of water by the side of the road and said, "There's a pool of water. What hinders me from being baptized in that pool?" What hinders you indeed? Nothing, except that in Philip's circle, he was an outsider. He was an outcast. In Philip's circle, he didn't belong, could never belong. And I suspect that Philip carried that kind of mindset with him. When the eunuch ask this question of him. Dare I bring this man into the community who has always been excluded from it? But what is to hinder him? There had never been any question that he didn't belong in the community. He couldn't belong in the community, but now he was asking for inclusion. And what would the community say when he went back to them? How would they act towards him when they discovered that he had baptized an Ethiopian eunuch? And he didn't have anybody to consult with. He had to make the decision right then and there. What do we do when suddenly we are confronted, like Philip, with a situation which is entirely new to us, and we must proceed with nothing except our gut instinct about what is the right thing to do here? Interestingly enough, as I've thought about this for my own ministry, the stories that come to mind have been around baptism. There are stories of inclusion, but there are also stories about how the contacts we made don't always fit into the neat categories. My imagination of what my ministry was going to be like didn't include these stories when they happened. I want to share a couple with you. One happened in Winnipeg. A member of my congregation asked me if I would speak to one of her friends. This friend was a devout Roman Catholic. So I said I would meet her, and the woman came and shared her story with me. And their story was that she and her partner had both gone through messy divorces, and they were quite gun-shy about getting married again. However, they had been living together for several years, and as sometimes happens, a child was born into that relationship. Her partner was an Anglican, and he felt that the church had played a part in the breakup of his marriage, so he was really angry at the church, deathly against it, and would have absolutely nothing to do with his child being baptized. So, on her own, she had gone to her priest in the parish that she worshipped in and asked to have her son baptized, and the priest refused to do so. He had told her that when the boy was old enough, he could make up his own mind whether he wanted to be baptized or not, and then he could come to the priest and ask for baptism. She was actively attending the parish and bringing her baby with her. And she said, if he can be baptized as an adult when he makes the decision, why can't he be baptized now as a baby? Is this the normal practice? After all, it wasn't his fault that he was born into this situation. It was a sin of his parents, if there was sin happening here. And she should, and the priest should baptize the baby. But the priest was adamant he wasn't going to do it. So, would I baptize the baby? But she wasn't going to become a United Church Christian. She was going to stay a devout Catholic. But she wanted to have a baptized baby. So, I mean, as you can see, I couldn't turn to any page in the book of order that told me what to do in this situation. I made the decision, yes, I would baptize the baby. And I told her, actually, it was interesting because if the baby was baptized in our church, that baptism would be recognized in the Roman Catholic Church. So he was getting into the church by the back door. So we went through the classes. And the little anecdote about the day of the baptism is one that I continue to chuckle at. That in that church at that time, this was in the 70s, there was baptism happened about once a month, and there were usually at least 5 or more babies to be baptized at once. And when the time for the baptism came, they would all come in and line up across the front. And I would ask the baptism questions of all of the parents at the same time, and then the baptism questions of the congregation. And then I would go up to the first couple and take the baby, ask the name, go over to the baptismal font, baptize the baby, come back and give the baby back to the parents, and they would move to the end of the line and everybody would shuffle up, and it was an assembly line. And I just kept on baptizing babies along the assembly line until I got back to the beginning again. So when this couple's turn came, I took the baby from the mother, went over and baptized the baby, and turned around, and there was a man standing there with his hands out, ready to receive the baby back. And the mother was standing next to him. So I went and gave the baby back to the man, but I thought, how would I miss this? Like, I don't remember seeing this guy. How did he get there? So next Tuesday at the staff meeting, I said, did I miss something? Where did this guy come from? And one of the staff members said, as soon as I took the baby and turned around to go to the baptismal font, he got up out of the congregation where he'd been sitting and came up and joined his wife. So that was the end of that story. Another story about baptism. In Vernon, after I retired, the minister asked me if I'd phoned and asked if I'd come in. He had a problem that he needed some help with. So I went in, and the problem was that there was a young person, a member of the congregation, who had been baptized as a baby boy and who was going through a sex reassignment, was becoming a woman, and she wanted to be rebaptized as a woman. Now, in United Church polity, we're very adamant about the fact that once baptized, in whatever tradition you're baptized in, you can only be baptized once. Whatever tradition people come into the United Church from, the baptism in that tradition is accepted. If somebody has a sudden conversion experience and they want to be rebaptized again, we say no. You can't be rebaptized again. You can only be baptized once in the church. And here's this young woman who's asking to be rebaptized. Not because it's a conversion experience, we decided as we talked, but because we had accepted her as a young baby boy, and she wanted to know if she still belonged as an adult woman. And so we decided that here the rules didn't apply, and she was going to be rebaptized so that she knew she continued to belong. We did the baptism at a special service, and had a church that was quite full of members of the congregation who came to provide the community for that baptism to happen in. And then the third example I want to use is that a long time ago, some theological minds in our denomination proposed that we would move to adult baptism, that in the United Church we would stop baptizing babies and we would have adult baptism, and that babies would be dedicated. And that was the proposal that came out from the General Council, saying this was the change they were proposing. And the pushback came from parents. All across the church, parents said, oh, let me just backtrack. They said one of the reasons they wanted to do this was because in the United Church there were only two sacraments. There was the sacrament of baptism and the sacrament of communion. And they thought that the two sacraments ought to be tied together, except that they weren't, because in our tradition, communion was tied to confirmation, adult confirmation. So they would solve that problem by having adult baptism, and then baptized people could come to the communion table. But as I said, parents pushed back. They said, we don't want to dedicate our children. We want to baptize our children. That's very important to us. And so the church relented and said, we'll go ahead with infant baptism, except that the problem still existed that the two weren't connected. And that's one of the places where the movement towards having children welcomed at the table grew out of that desire to connect baptism and communion once again. And I can remember one of the big arguments was, we can't have children come to communion. They won't understand what's going on. My counter always was, if you understand what's going on, explain it to me. Because I don't understand what's going on. It's not something that we do with our minds, it's something we do with our hearts and with our bodies. It's an experience of oneness with Jesus and with the community. And so I think that's one of the big pushes for having children come to communion. So, as I said at the beginning, I hoped that the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch was based on a historical account, because I think it's a much better story. I can imagine Philip coming back to the community at the end of his travels and them saying, "So Philip, how did your trip go?" "Oh, it went great. I baptized an Ethiopian eunuch on the desert road." "You what?" "Well, it seemed like the right thing to do." So the church goes on.